of bones, usually we think of skeletons, Halloween, crazy things like that, and we associate bones with the dead and decomposing body. But bones are actually living, and it's sometimes hard for us to get it in our mind that bones are actually living. And as we think about bones being alive, we ought to think back to the characteristics of life, because bones are going to have a lot of those characteristics of life because they are in fact living. And so we might ask ourselves, how do we know that bones are living? What are some things that bones do? So let's start with that. What are some things that bones do?
Foot bone connected to the leg bone. The leg bone connected to the knee bone. The knee bone connected to the thigh bone. The thigh bone connected to the backbone. The backbone connected to the neck bone.
One thing, your skeleton is a framework of bones and cartilage. Those are the two main things that make up your skeleton. The bones and the cartilage. Bones are the harder parts here. Cartilage, slightly more flexible than the bones. One of the things that bones do, and they do really well, is provide a framework of support for your body. So your body's not oozing around under doors and around corners, but bones gives you a support framework, allows you to stand upright. Bones also allow for movement, that is, muscles can pull on bones and the bones act as levers, and it can help move your body in all kinds of different directions, and they articulate in all kinds of different ways because of your joints. But bones allow you to have some sort of movement. Bones also offer protection. That is, your skull, for example, is protecting your brain, which is a very soft and valuable organ. You wouldn't want anything to happen to your brain. So the bones around it, the cranial bones around it, offer some protection. Your heart and lungs, very valuable organs. You wouldn't want anything to happen to them. The bones of your rib cage offer some protection. Bones also store minerals, calcium, phosphorus. In the bone matrix, they store those minerals so your body can use those things for other things. For example, phosphorus can be used for energy, and calcium can be used for blood clotting. So there's a lot of things that minerals can be used for, but they're stored. The reservoir for those minerals is in bones. Bones also store fat. Yellow bone marrow inside of your bones, deep inside your bones, is a great location to store fat, which might not come as much of a surprise if you think about your grandmother maybe making some green beans for Thanksgiving and throws a ham bone in the green beans. Why? Well, like you say, it gives it flavor. All right, what flavor does it give it? Well, the fat in that ham bone provides some flavor for the green bean dish. So there's fat stored in bones. Yellow bone marrow stores some fat. Bones also produce red blood cells. So when you're looking at like where are red blood cells made and manufactured? In the red bone marrow. So bones provide red blood cells. Which raises this interesting question. If someone gets a bone marrow transplant, how will that actually affect the DNA of their blood? Interestingly, if their bone marrow gets transplanted, if it's someone else's bone marrow inserted into theirs, and that bone marrow is what's making the blood, then it's going to have the DNA of that person. So if you want to change your DNA around, you can get a bone marrow transplant to kind of change your... So which of these is not a function of bones? So bone does all this except it's not an attachment for nerve. How many bones do humans have? So when you look at a typical adult human, how many bones are you looking at? Typically around 206 bones. And do babies have more or less bones than adults? Surprisingly, babies actually have more bones. And that's because their bones haven't fused together. A lot of the adult bones have actually grown together into one, but as an infant, they're two separate pieces. And how are male and female skeletons a little bit different? One difference is that male bones are slightly more dense than female bones. They're a little denser. But there are some other differences actually in the skeleton itself. Most notably, though, is the pelvis. You can see in the male pelvis, the subpubic angle is around 90 degrees, whereas in the female, it's greater than 90 degrees. You can also see this internal opening of the pelvis, pelvic bones, is much narrower in the male than in the female. It would be much wider. And that, of course, is to allow the baby to pass through. That's one of the major differences. When we look at bone structure itself, we'll notice that the outside of the bone has this layer of membrane called periosteum. This membrane is going to contain things like blood vessels, which will supply nourishment to the bone, nerves, which is why your bones might hurt when they get broken or banged up pretty hard. And then those are going to help maintain and repair the bone. Those blood vessels and nerves, that periosteum, that's this major function. The next layer of bone then is this dense or compact bone, the part of the bone that's the strong part. And then this inside part of the bone is spongy bone. So one question we might have is, why not just have all dense, compact bone? Why is just this outer layer compact, this inside layer more lattice-like, spongy? Well, one of the reasons is we can still maintain a lot of strength with the bone by having this outer layer compact, but this inner layer with that lattice-like structure, or having those openings and then that spongy part of it, that allows the bones to be very lightweight. So this combination of dense and spongy allows the bones to be both lightweight and strong. Whereas if it were all dense, compact bone, then for one thing we would lose a lot of the bone functions, but for another thing, bones would be very heavy and it would be much harder to move around. So let's try to use some clues to figure out which is which. So which is the brown, which is the blue? One of them is going to be spongy, the other is going to be compact. So here's a clue: lattice-like compared to dense. Here's another clue: we find it typically in the ends of bone as opposed to in the shaft of the bone, the long part of the bone. We would find it would be filled with red bone marrow. This would be associated more with periosteum. And this would also have yellow bone marrow. So could you use the clues to kind of figure out which is which? This is the dense, compact bone here. This, the spongy bone here. So which is not associated with spongy bone? And that would be the periosteum, this outer covering of the bone. So which is this? What kind of bone is that? Well, that's the spongy bone. And you can see how it has a structure where there's lots of pores in it, like a sponge. Here's what the bone looks like on a more macro level. Then some of the major parts of bone, we can see the spongy bone associated with the ends of the bone, the epiphysis, the head of the bone. We can see the compact bone here associated with the shaft, the diaphysis, the shaft of the bone. We can see the periosteum still, this kind of outer layer of bone. We look at bone cells specifically or microscopically, what bone kind of looks like on the inside here. We'll see that it has these kind of concentric rings. We'll see the bone cells here, these kind of dark, solid areas. They're occupying a space called a lacuna. And we'll see this opening in the center of the bone called the Haversian canal, the place where blood vessels can actually travel through some of this bone matrix. So all this together, the bone cells plus the matrix around it, is called an osteon. These rings, bone cells, and the matrix around it. Remember, bone is connective tissue, so it's going to be a cell plus the matrix around it. That's called an osteon. The osteon then has these HACC canals. So there's a whole bunch of these osteons that are going to make up that dense, compact bone. Same thing now, just a little different view. You can see the central canal, the HACC canal. You can see the laminella, these concentric rings. You can see the osteocyte, the mature bone cell, inside that space, this kind of hollowed out space. So remember, bones are living tissue. So bones are going to have these characteristics of life. So what are some characteristics of life? Well, one is that bones are made of cells. And some of the cells that make up bone include osteocytes, mature bone cells, osteoclasts, which break down bone. So whenever you have like pieces of bone floating around your body, maybe you shattered your arm or something, osteocytes are the mature bone cells. Osteoclasts will break down those bone parts. Also, if your bones are releasing calcium, the osteoclasts are going to break down that bone to help release the calcium that's in that matrix. And then your bone gets remodeled, that is, your skeleton gets replaced over time. And then it's the osteoclasts that are gradually breaking down that bone so that it can be replaced. Osteoblasts are the building cells. They're the ones that are replacing it. They're rebuilding the skeleton. So they're converting that cartilage to bone, or they're adding new bone cells or making the bone stronger. Bones are made of cells. So which of the following is a mature bone cell? So here we're looking for the mature bone cell. So osteo means bone, cyte means cell, osteocyte. Living things have chemical reactions. We call that metabolism. So how do bones get materials so that it can do that metabolism? It's the long, slow process of diffusion. Going from one bone cell diffusing out and into the next bone cell, diffusing out of that into the next one. So it's a long, slow process of diffusion to get materials around the bones. Some of the materials that bones are most interested in using are calcium and phosphorus. Remember, they're going to store those minerals particularly. The calcium helps to make the bones strong. Phosphorus our body often uses for energy. Collagen is a protein material that your bones manufacture. And that's going to give bones some flexibility. So if we could take out a bone and we just put it in acid for a while, and we can somehow dissolve all of the calcium that's stored in it, we would pull out a very flimsy bone. Alright, it would be flimsy because it would be mostly collagen without the calcium. If we could somehow get rid of all the collagen, just have the calcium, our bones would be hard and brittle, like chalk, chalkboard chalk, or sidewalk chalk. And it would shatter really easily. But to have a combination of the calcium and the collagen allows our bones to be very strong but flexible. So if someone has trouble with super brittle bones, what might the doctor look for? The answer might surprise you. We might say, well, how would having brittle bones have anything to do with any of these options? Well, remember that bones store calcium. Calcium is going to help the blood clot. Calcium is needed for muscles to contract, so that's going to, or could lead to some heart problems if we don't have enough calcium or too much. And then our inner ear is where the smallest bones are located. So if our bones are brittle and they're not able to vibrate with sound, then we'll have a difficult time hearing. So in fact, all of these options is the answer. Bones grow because living things grow. And we might say, like, how do bones grow? Well, there's a couple different ways. One is that they develop. So here's a picture of an infant skeleton. Notice that it's mostly cartilage. And the bones are going to develop that cartilaginous skeleton into a harder, more rigid one. They also grow in length, and when bones grow in length, so if this is our bone right here, it grows in length from the epiphysis, that is, from the growth plates on the outside parts of the bone. So it's going to grow from here out. It's going to grow from this end out. So let's say that you had a bone problem, the surgeon went in, the surgeon fixed your bone, and then just because they wanted to, they put their initials on your bone. If they were to go back a year or so later, where would they find these initials? Well, they would find them pretty much in the same location that they put them, because the bone's only growing from here outward. But the bone also gets thicker. As it gets longer, it gets thicker too. And when it does, so here we have our bone, here we have this, the internal part of the bone where the marrow is, the spongy bone. As the bone gets thicker, as it starts growing out, this cavity also increases in size. So it's going to maintain that ratio of dense bone to compact bone, even though it's getting thicker as you're getting older. So here's an example again of how bone is living and how that cartilage skeleton of the infant gets replaced by the mature bone of the adult. So it starts off very much cartilage, but gradually the osteoclasts are eating away some of the cartilage and cavities and replacing it. The osteoblasts are replacing it with bone until most of that cartilage is just in the ends. We call those the growth plates, and where the joints meet, so there's some cartilage there for shock absorption. But the bones are going to grow from this growth plate, the epiphysis, out. So we call that the epiphyseal plate, the growth plate, epiphyseal plate in the epiphysis. So the shaft is also getting hollowed out as it's getting thicker and thicker as the person's maturing and growing in size and age. So we can estimate the age of an individual by how much cartilage they have in their skeleton. Lots of cartilage, very young individual. Not much cartilage, much older individual. So how is an infant skeleton different than an adult skeleton? Well, you say, well, they have these fontanelles, these places where the bones haven't yet connected. And that's true, that's one thing, but there are some other things about the baby skeleton that's a little different than the adult skeleton. One of the obvious ones is that the baby skeleton is just smaller. So if you were looking at a skeleton, you might say, oh, that belongs to a baby or an infant. Why? The obvious thing is just that it's a smaller skeleton. Another thing is that it has more cartilage because it hasn't been replaced yet with the bones. And then a baby skeleton has more bones because as an adult skeleton is being formed, those bones will fuse together into one bone. Whereas in an infant, they're still distinct with that often band of cartilage between. What are the steps to bone healing? When bones heal, what happens? Let's say you were to break a bone. How do they heal? What happens? Well, the first thing that happens is going to be a blood clot. Because remember, there's a lot of blood vessels traveling through the bones. We've got to stop that bleeding right away. So the first thing that's going to happen is a blood clot is going to form. Then some cartilaginous cells will form around that clot, trying to seal that area. Those cartilaginous cells are going to be replaced, though, gradually by osteoclasts. They're going to eat away those cartilaginous cells. The bone fragments are going to be dissolved. And then they'll be replaced. The osteoblasts, the rebuilding cells, will replace that cartilage with bone so that we'll have our new, completely healed bone. Bones maintain homeostasis because that's part of what living things do. They maintain homeostasis. And one of the ways they do that is with the interaction of hormones. So partly bones are going to act to maintain homeostasis in the whole body and then also in themselves. But hormones are going to play a large role in that maintaining homeostasis. Some of the major hormones that are involved with bones are calcitonin and parathormone. What calcitonin does, that's a hormone that's going to help deposit calcium into the bone. So calcium goes out of the blood and into the bones to make the bones strong. Parathormone just does the opposite. So parathormone, parathyroid hormone, or PTH, is going to cause the calcium to leave the bones and enter the blood so that we can use that calcium for other things like muscle contraction, blood clot. So the question is, what cells are being stimulated by those hormones? So calcitonin, if it's depositing calcium into the bone, then that's going to stimulate the osteoblasts, the bone-forming cells, the bone-rebuilding cells. If it's parathormone, we're trying to release calcium, then that's going to stimulate the osteoclasts, the bone-dissolving cells. Human growth hormone is going to stimulate bones to grow. So the bones are going to get bigger, longer, thicker. So human growth hormone. Estrogen also plays a role in bone remodeling. That is the gradual replacing of your bone over time. So in the period of around 5 to 7 years, your skeleton is going to be pretty much replaced by a new skeleton. Estrogen has a lot to do with that. So the female hormone estrogen has a lot to do with stimulating your bones to remodel or replace itself. The problem is, as females get older and they go through menopause and they're not producing as much estrogen, that means their skeleton isn't being remodeled like it used to be. So now, rather than being eaten away and replaced at the same rate, the osteoclasts are eating away the skeleton, but the osteoblasts aren't stimulated to replace it. And so that begins to develop brittle bones. We call it osteoporosis because the bones start to develop porous sections to it, and they get weaker and more brittle that way. So which hormone helps to make bones strong? By adding calcium. So we're going to add calcium to the bone. In that case, that's calcitonin. Bones maintain homeostasis. That means the more stress you put on the bone, it's going to respond. So for example, if you're lifting weights, as you do, those muscles pull on the bone. So the bone has to be able to withstand that pull of that muscle. So the muscles are embedded into the bone, they're pulling on it. So as they pull on that bone has to respond. One of the ways it responds is by getting thicker and stronger. So as you're doing weight-bearing exercise and your muscles are pulling on your bones respond back. They're living. They're going to respond to that stress. And in this case, the response is going to be to make thicker, stronger bones. So as ladies are getting older, one of the things that doctors often encourage them to do is to engage in some weight-bearing exercises so that as their muscles pull on their bones, they can get stronger. An astronaut, for example, that spends weeks in space without the force of gravity pulling on their bones, without the ability to have weight-bearing exercise because they're in a zero-gravity environment, their bones often get very weak as a result because there's no stress from that exercise to keep them strong. So what minerals do bones store? Calcium and phosphorus. What does red bone marrow do? Makes red blood cells. How many bones are in the human body? 206. Which hormone reduces blood calcium? So we're reducing blood calcium. That means calcium's going out of the blood into the bone. Alright, so that's calcitonin. Do that. Which is not a factor in osteoporosis. So we're thinking about how the bones become more porous over time. So age definitely is a factor. Lack of exercise can be a factor. Gender, because it typically affects females more than males because of the lack of estrogen. So size would be a good answer. So I hope you've enjoyed this little blurb about bones.
The backbone connected to the thigh bone.